Episode N, the Excommunication Weapon, Silencing Dissent in the Name of God, Excommunication. A word that, in many ways, defines the relationship between the LDS Church and its critics. Excommunication is often seen as a tool for purging sin within the Mormon Church, but in practice, it has evolved into something far more insidious. It is a weapon used to silence dissent, eliminate opposition, and maintain institutional control. This evolution didn't just happen overnight. It began with Joseph Smith and continued to be wielded with precision and power as the Church grew. Excommunication has always been a part of the LDS Church's history, but over time, its purpose shifted. Originally, it was used as a means of dealing with serious sins, adultery, theft, and other offenses that threatened the supposed moral purity of the congregation. But as the Church grew, excommunication began to serve another function, protecting the institution and ensuring that no one could challenge its leadership, no matter how valid their concerns might be. The LDS Church has long used excommunication as a means of protecting its hierarchical structure. Dissent, even when based on solid historical evidence or moral conviction, is often labeled as apostasy. D. Michael Quinn, The Mormon Hierarchy, Extensions of Power. While excommunication as a tool to protect the institution is often associated with the later years in Far West and Nauvoo, it actually began much earlier. From the early Kirtland era, Joseph Smith used excommunication as a way to silence critics and consolidate his power. And these early actions laid the foundation for a pattern that would be repeated throughout the history of the Church. In the 1830s, the Church was still in its infancy. The movement was filled with fervent believers, but also with dissenters, people who questioned Joseph's teachings and leadership. A notable example was Warren Parrish, a former scribe to Smith, who was excommunicated after his involvement in a failed attempt to storm the Kirtland Temple, claiming Joseph was abusing his authority. Parrish's excommunication marked an early use of church discipline to silence criticism and maintain control, a strategy that would become more prominent as the Church expanded and faced increasing opposition. One of the earliest examples of excommunication used to silence dissent occurred with Oliver Cowdery. Cowdery was one of the original 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon and a close confidant of Joseph Smith. But as time went on, Cowdery began to question Joseph's leadership and the direction the Church was taking. In 1838, in Far West Missouri, Cowdery publicly disagreed with Smith over the handling of church finances, the Fanny Alger affair, and as a result, he was excommunicated. The real reason for Cowdery's excommunication was his opposition to Joseph Smith's polygamous relationship with Fanny Alger. It was not adultery that was punished, but exposing the prophet's secret. Gerald and Sandra Tanner, Mormonism, Shadow or Reality. Cowdery's excommunication was not an isolated incident. David Whitmer, another one of the 3 witnesses, was excommunicated as well in 1838. Whitmer had serious concerns about Joseph's growing power and influence. He disagreed with Joseph's actions and the authoritarian structure of the Church. Whitmer was not afraid to voice these concerns, and as a result, he was excommunicated. "I was cast out for the same reason that Joseph Smith was, the desire to preserve our own integrity." David Whitmer. At this stage, it was clear that Joseph Smith was using excommunication not just as a tool for purging sin, but as a method of control. Those who dared to challenge his leadership were swiftly removed from the Church, and their voices were silenced. And the Kirtland era wasn't an anomaly. This pattern continued in the years that followed, particularly as the Church moved to Far West. When the Church moved to Far West, tensions escalated. Sidney Rigdon, Joseph's close ally, played a crucial role in excommunicating those who spoke out against Joseph's leadership. Those who had been loyal to Joseph for years were now being cast aside because they dared to challenge his authority. This included figures like William Law, who would later become one of the Church's most infamous apostates. Law, once a prominent member of the Church, found himself excommunicated and publicly shunned after speaking out against Joseph's leadership and practices. His excommunication served as a warning to others who might have similar concern. Excommunication in Nauvoo became a strategic act, employed not to address sin, but to purge dissenters from theocratic power. Brent Metcalf, New Approaches to the Book of Mormon. By the time the church had established itself in Nauvoo, excommunication had become a sophisticated weapon for maintaining power. It wasn't just about silencing critics. It was about preventing the spread of ideas that could undermine the authority of Joseph Smith and the church as a whole. Then there's Douglas Wallace, a man who defied the church's racial restrictions decades before they were lifted. In 1976, Wallace ordained a black man to the priesthood, at a time when the church prohibited black men from holding that office. His action was seen as an act of defiance, and he was quickly excommunicated. I was excommunicated for doing what they would do just a few years later. I wasn't wrong, I was just early. Douglas Wallace, Personal Statement, 1976. Wallace's story exemplifies how excommunication has often been used not to punish wrongdoing, but to maintain control in the face of changing social pressures. When excommunication is used to suppress historical inquiry or moral reform, it stops being a spiritual practice and becomes an institutional reflex. D. Michael Quinn. The most famous coordinated crackdown on intellectual dissent came in September 1993, when 6 prominent intellectuals and scholars were excommunicated or disfellowshipped by the LDS Church. These individuals, who came to be known as the September 6, were accused of apostasy. But their crime wasn't committing any moral sins. It was raising difficult questions about the Church's history, doctrines, and practices. D. Michael Quinn, a historian, challenged the official narrative of LDS history. His research into the Church's past uncovered uncomfortable truths, including early Mormon polygamy and the Church's policies on race. Lavina Fielding Anderson, a scholar and editor, criticized the Church's treatment of women and its handling of sensitive issues like gender and sexuality. Maxine Hanks and Paul Toscano, both feminists, called for a reevaluation of the role of women in the Church and challenged its patriarchal structure. They weren't preaching heresy, they were challenging institutional dogma. But their voices were silenced. Excommunication was the weapon used to shut them down. In response to their excommunications, the Church issued a statement that accused the September 6 of teaching false doctrine. But in reality, their real crime was not doctrinal heresy, it was intellectual dissent. This was made even clearer by the excommunication of Grant Palmer, an author who challenged the Church's historical foundations. Grant Palmer had been a faithful member of the Church for years, serving as a Church Education System (CES) director. But in the early 2000s, he published An Insider's View of Mormon Origins, a book that presented a critical analysis of the Church's foundational claims. Palmer questioned the traditional narrative of the Book of Mormon's translation and suggested that the Church's origin story was more reflective of 19th century folk magic than divine intervention. I wanted to reconcile the historical record with the traditional story, but when I tried to talk about it, I found there was no room in the Church for honest inquiry. Grant Palmer, interview with Salt Lake Tribune, 2005. Palmer's excommunication came in 2004. For simply advocating historical transparency and academic honesty, he was cast out. Another modern example is Kate Kelly, founder of Ordain Women, a group that advocated for gender equality in the LDS Church, specifically for women's ordination to the priesthood. Kelly organized public demonstrations and launched a campaign to push for greater inclusion of women in church leadership. Despite her efforts being rooted in faithful engagement, her actions were seen as threatening to church authority. Asking for equality should not be a punishable offense, but in this church, even respectful questions are met with discipline. Kate Kelly, 2014. In June 2014, Kelly was excommunicated for apostasy. Her stake leaders cited her public advocacy and refusal to back down as the reasons for her removal. Like others before her, she was not punished for personal sin, but for challenging institutional norms. When church leaders define obedience as silence, anyone who speaks up, especially women, is viewed as dangerous. Lavina Fielding Anderson. And in recent years, the case of John Dalen, founder of Mormon Stories podcast, underscores how the church continues to wield excommunication to control the narrative. Dalen created one of the most influential platforms for progressive and ex-Mormon voices. His podcast gave space to LGBTQ+ individuals, scholars, and those struggling with faith crises. The church accused him of apostasy, not for abandoning belief, but for speaking too publicly and too honestly. They weren't upset about private disbelief. They were upset about public discussion. Silence is what they wanted. John Dalen, Mormon Stories interview, 2015. Dalen was excommunicated in 2015. His story highlights the ongoing effort by church leadership to control not just what members believe, but what they say, what they publish, and how they engage with difficult truths. For the LDS Church, obedience is the first law of heaven, and those who disobey, especially publicly, are often made examples of through excommunication. Gerald and Sandra Tanner. Sam Young, a former bishop, found himself excommunicated for advocating reform of church practices regarding children. He launched a campaign to end the practice of one-on-one bishop interviews with minors, during which sexually explicit questions were sometimes asked. Young argued these interviews were inappropriate, traumatizing, and created environments ripe for abuse. He organized marches, petitions, and media appearances to raise awareness. Children were being harmed, and all I wanted was policy reform. Instead, they came after me like I was an enemy. Sam Young, press release after excommunication, 2018. Despite his motives being rooted in child protection, Young was excommunicated in 2018. Not for doctrinal heresy, but for refusing to back down from public advocacy. Over the years, the Church has refined its use of excommunication. It is no longer just a tool for purging sin. It is a weapon for protecting power. Today, excommunication is still used to silence critics, whether they are challenging the Church's history, its teachings, or its practices. And while some might argue that excommunication is about spiritual restoration, the history of the Church suggests otherwise. In the end, excommunication is not about sin. It is about control. And it is a powerful tool that has been wielded by the Church for nearly 2 centuries to eliminate any threats to its authority. And as the Church continues to grow, it seems that excommunication will remain an essential part of the Church's arsenal, a weapon to ensure that no one can challenge its leadership or its teachings. Hope you picked up something new in this episode. Don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for more no-nonsense Ex-Mormon content. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for today.